On the day of trying on the wedding dress, Isabella suddenly disappeared. I called her, but she hung up on me mercilessly. You and your mother have been morally blackmailing me for so many years. Isn't that enough? Tell her not to worry. I will definitely marry you and take care of her until she dies. Let her rest assured. These 2 sentences stimulated my mother so much that she had an attack and passed away. That night, I scrolled through a WeChat Moments post by her little secretary. I accidentally had a car accident. My CEO sister came to take care of me in person and even gave me 999 roses. So touched. In the picture, among the rose petals scattered all over the ground, there were lingerie and dresses. The reflection in the window glass showed Isabella's bare back with long hair, holding a cigarette. At that moment, feeling completely hopeless, I texted her. Let's break up, Isabella. I don't want to marry you anymore. After sending the message, there was still no response. Looking at my mother's still open eyes after her death and holding her already cold hand, I burst into tears. From today on, I no longer have a mother. A few hours ago, my mother still had a healthy complexion and said that she could finally see me marry Isabella. But when it was time to try on the wedding dress, Isabella didn't show up for a long time. My mother advised me to be patient, saying that she must have something urgent and didn't have time to tell me. But when I called, Isabella lashed out at me. You and your mother have been morally blackmailing me for so many years. Isn't that enough? The heartbreaking accusation made my mother turn pale. I said eagerly, it's not like that. Before I could finish my words, Isabella hung up the phone impatiently. There's an urgent matter in the company, and I can't get away. Tell your mother not to use moral blackmail. I will definitely marry you, take care of her until she dies, and let her rest assured. This sentence severely stimulated my mother. She couldn't hold on any longer, spat out a mouthful of blood, and fell into a coma. From the moment I found her missing to my mother's death, in just a few hours, my mother and I were separated by life and death. Sitting outside the mortuary, I looked at the moonlight outside the window, as cold as water, and only felt a bone-chilling cold and pain. Isabella's phone still couldn't be reached, but her little secretary Julian updated his WeChat Moments. I accidentally had a car accident. My CEO sister came to take care of me in person and even gave me 999 roses. So touched. In the picture, among the rose petals scattered all over the ground, there were lingerie and dresses. The reflection in the window glass showed Isabella's bare back with long hair, holding a cigarette. At that moment, I finally understood that this was what she meant by the so-called urgent matter. Feeling completely disheartened, I raised my hand and sent Isabella the last message. Let's break up, Isabella. I don't want to marry you anymore. After sending the message, I blocked and deleted her and the little secretary on WeChat. Until the next day when my mother's body was cremated, I received a special attention notification sound. It was Isabella's Weibo alternate account that was updated. She posted a live-action photo of the little secretary acting coquettishly while hugging her. In the off-screen voice, he was acting coquettishly and laughing, calling her sister. The caption read, "Little boys just love to act coquettishly. He even wanted to leave hickeys on me. It hurt so much when he sucked." The comment below was from Julian with a kitten avatar. "Who told you, sister, to get married so soon? This is a little punishment for you. Do you know you were wrong?" The pain in my heart intensified, and the cold wind blew directly into my bleeding wound. While she was taking care of the little secretary carefully in the hospital, my mother was being rescued in the emergency room. While they were flirting affectionately in the VIP ward, my mother's body had already been burned to ashes. I was wrong. It was the fault of our whole family. Holding my mother's ashes, I felt extremely heartbroken and remembered my mother's last words. I never knew Isabella had such great resentment in her heart. But I never intended to force her to marry you. Cough cough. Lucas, promise me that if she doesn't want to, then set her free. I choked up and nodded desperately. A year ago, on the day Isabella proposed to me, my mother was diagnosed with advanced cancer. She said, "Don't tell Isabella about my illness. I will die without regrets if I can see you two get married." But none of us expected that Isabella would change her heart. In the end, my mother passed away with regret and resentment. It was Isabella who proposed to me a year ago, and it was also her who fled from the wedding and accused us of moral blackmail a year later. At this moment, I hated her deeply. Holding my mother's ashes, I answered the phone call from the hotel manager. "Please change the wedding 2 days later into a funeral for me. Thank you." After arranging the hotel matters, Someone from the hospital called to tell me that my mother had left something behind and hoped that I would go back to pick it up. I ran into Isabella in the hospital corridor. She was pushing Julian for a walk. You have no idea. I just disappeared for 2 days, and they were hounding me like they were after my life, as if they were afraid I would run away. I've never seen such a blood-sucking family. Back then, his father sacrificed his life to ask me to take care of his mother for 5 years. His mother is also so thick-skinned. She always said that I was like her daughter and hoped that I could become a real part of their family. Isn't she just playing the victim to make me marry Lucas? I'm about to marry him, but he's pretending now, saying he doesn't want to marry me anymore and that his mother is dead. He even blocked me. Just because I didn't go back for 1 day, he's threatening and lying to me like this, and even cursing his own mother. Isabella sneered. Hearing her words, my heart ached. Julian sighed, Sister Isabella, although I don't know much about it. But I think you've already done more than enough. They're in such a hurry. Maybe they have other motives. Isabella frowned and asked him what he meant. You're just too kind, sister. Think about it carefully. Why was his father able to show up in time to save you when you were kidnapped? You're the daughter of the Isabella group. Saving you is like getting wealth and glory, right? It's not that I'm being conspiracy-minded, but I just think it's a bit strange. Why would someone risk their life to save someone who has nothing to do with them? His conspiracy theories and malicious speculations stabbed me deeply. One night 5 years ago, my father was stabbed to death by the kidnappers while trying to save Isabella. After hearing the news, my mother was so devastated that she had a stroke and became paralyzed. Isabella's family was extremely grateful to us. She was their precious only daughter, the apple of their eye. Perhaps because of the attitude of her family, or maybe she was truly touched, Isabella hugged me and promised, Brother Lucas, don't be afraid. I will accompany you to take care of Auntie for the rest of my life. In the following 5 years, she did indeed stay with me to take care of my mother and even paid for her to receive the best treatment. Isabella's kindness to us made us think that she was already part of our family. A year ago, on the day my mother was diagnosed with advanced cancer, Isabella happened to propose to me. We hid it from her just to prevent her from being sad. But later, after she hired Julian, this fresh and cute young secretary who had just graduated, she started to change. She began to use overtime as an excuse, going on business trips with him all the time and having fun everywhere. I was busy taking care of my mother's illness and was already too tired to deal with it. I just thought that since she proposed, she must want to marry me. But I was wrong. Sincerity can change in an instant. The balance in Isabella's heart had long tilted towards the fresh, handsome, and understanding Julian. At this moment, since Julian was smearing and maliciously speculating about my father like this, I really wanted to see Isabella's attitude. She raised a sarcastic smile and gently pushed Julian's wheelchair. With a sudden gust of cold wind, her sneer reached my ears. Who knows? At that moment, I was shaking all over, and tears couldn't be held back anymore and welled up in my eyes. My father was such a kind person. He lost his life to save Isabella, but in the end, what he got was her allowing others to smear him and make malicious speculations. In the past 5 years, she clearly often created various surprises and touching moments for me. She would hug me and say she loved me over and over again. But now, in her heart, all these have turned into my wishful thinking, my persistent pestering, and moral blackmail. At this moment, I couldn't hold on any longer and knelt down on the ground. Since my mother passed away, I hadn't rested much for 2 days and 2 nights. I really wanted to chase after them and ask for clarification, but my body was shaking and numb, and I couldn't control myself. If I had a choice, I would like to travel back 5 years ago and stop my father from saving Isabella. In this way, my father wouldn't have died, and my mother wouldn't have become depressed and her health wouldn't have broken down. The raging fire of resentment consumed me, and I let out a mournful cry from my throat. The 2 people who were about to leave finally noticed me lying on the ground. Lucas, why are you here? Are you following me? Isabella turned around, frowned, and asked me coldly. I used all my strength to stand up, leaning against the wall. Before I could say anything, Julian smiled and spoke. This must be Brother Lucas, right? I've always envied you. I didn't expect to meet you before the wedding. I looked down at him sitting in the wheelchair coldly and sneered. What are you envious of? Envious that I lost both my parents at a young age? Seeing my sarcastic tone, Julian's eyes turned red, and he hid behind Isabella. I didn't mean that. I meant that I envy you for being able to marry someone as wonderful as Sister Isabella. Isabella protected him behind her and angrily rebuked me. Lucas, It's no use for you to follow me. I've already made it clear that I'll attend the wedding on time. Instead of wasting time being jealous, you'd better take better care of your mother. Or did she ask you to come and get me back? Your mother's character, which is so prone to worry and melancholy, really should be changed. If she keeps thinking so much every day, her health will surely go wrong sooner or later. Then she'll end up like your short-lived father. Forcibly suppressing the urge to slap her, I said with red eyes. Don't worry about my family's affairs. You received the message, right? We've already broken up. Don't be so narcissistic as to think that I'm following you. My mother's last wish before she passed away was for me not to blame Isabella, and she also told me not to tell her the real reason for her death, so as not to burden her psychologically. I clenched my fists tightly and used all my strength to hold back from telling her. You want to break up with me? Are you crazy, Lucas? Don't you know how I've treated you and your family in the past 5 years? I advise you not to play any more tricks. Just go back and wait for me obediently. I ignored Isabella's ranting and turned around to get my mother's belongings. It was a cross-stitch that was almost finished. On it were me and Isabella holding hands. When my mother spat out blood and fell into a coma, she still held it tightly in her hand. That day, she was almost done with it. Looking at the two people on it stained with blood, my heart ached. When I got home, I placed it beside my mother's ashes. Then I took down the things she had hung out to dry from the balcony. There was a scarf she had knitted for me, which still retained the warm smell of the sun. She knitted it for me 2 years ago. Isabella also had one. Isabella, I saw that young people nowadays like to wear scarves with this diamond pattern, so I bought the thread and knitted a pair for you too. What do you think? On the surface, Isabella smiled and said thank you, but behind my back, she complained to me. The original one is a big brand, Burberry. Wearing this handmade imitation out will surely make people laugh at us. I'm going to donate it. Don't wear yours either. It's really ridiculous. I patiently persuaded her, after all, it's my mother's thoughtfulness. Keep it. But she didn't listen at all and still insisted on stuffing it into the donation box. Later, Isabella, who thought the imitation was embarrassing, when she received a high imitation necklace from the new secretary Julian, she wore it around the company all day long. After someone pointed out that it was a fake, she instead comforted Julian, saying that the thought was the most important. Now that I think about it, I realize that she just didn't like me. Because she didn't like me, she also didn't like the things my mother gave. But this was clearly the thoughtfulness stitched with every stitch and thread. I hugged the scarf tightly and buried my face in it, as if I could still smell the scent of the lanolin cream on my mother's hands. Bang! The door was kicked open, and Isabella came back with a fierce look on her face. Behind her was Julian, who was on crutches. Seeing me packing things, a trace of anger flashed in Isabella's eyes. What's wrong? Haven't you had enough of this? Are you planning to pack up and run away from home? In this past year, we always quarreled because of Julian. It wasn't me who ran away from home, but her. Every time we quarreled, she wouldn't show up for several days. Last year, it was my mother's birthday, but she forgot about it because she went to find Julian. I had a big fight with her. She slammed the door and didn't show up for a whole week. My mother was just ill, not insensitive. She also felt that Isabella had changed. So every time we quarreled, she would persuade me to go find Isabella and coax her. Until the last moment, she realized that Isabella didn't run away from home, but that she had never regarded our home as her own. We were not her family, but blood-sucking vampires in her eyes. That's why she advised me to forgive Isabella and set her free before she died. I'm just tidying up my mother's belongings. What do you want? I said coldly, not wanting to pay attention to her anymore. Isabella took a deep breath and sneered. So, your mother is still cooperating with you in this act? But she's paralyzed. Where could she have hidden? As she spoke, she started shouting for my mother and pushed open every door. Auntie, don't hide. I know you're at home. There was a reason why I left suddenly before. I brought someone here to explain to you. But she searched every room and didn't see my mother. All she saw was the urn with my mother's ashes on the cabinet and the wheelchair placed beside it. My mother had been using this wheelchair for 5 years. Lucas, where on earth have you hidden Auntie? My patience is running out. Isabella had a gloomy face. I pointed to the urn with my mother's ashes. I told you, my mother has passed away. That's her ashes in there. Because of the hurry, my mother's portrait hadn't been made yet. At this moment, Julian came in on crutches and saw the scarf at a glance. Wow, Auntie is so skillful. She can even knit a Burberry-style scarf. As he spoke, He was about to put it around his neck. This was knitted for me by my mother. Don't touch it with your dirty hands. I snatched the scarf back, but Julian lost his balance and fell to the ground. Brother Lucas, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to. He lay on the ground with red eyes and apologized in a low voice. Isabella rushed over to help him up and shouted at me. Are you crazy? Julian specifically insisted on coming here to explain and apologize. What's with your attitude? Mom is the same. At her age, she's still holding grudges and playing hide and seek like me. Doesn't she just want to punish me? She can't help it all when I'm busy, and she just makes all these useless things to annoy people. I've long been fed up with this old-fashioned scarf. As she spoke, she actually took a pair of scissors and directly cut the scarf to pieces. It's just a broken scarf. Even if I destroy it, your mother will still forgive me. Do you believe it? No. I roared and rushed forward to grab it, but it was already too late. The scarf was cut into strips by her and thrown on the ground. Julian grabbed my arm to stop me, and I slapped him to the ground. It hurt so much. He fell to the ground, holding his casted leg and howling. Isabella threw down the scissors and rushed over to slap me in the face. I hadn't slept for several days and nights and had no strength to resist. I felt dizzy and fell to the ground. Isabella helped Julian up, and the two of them stepped over the shredded remains of the scarf. Come on, you sit on this wheelchair first. Seeing Julian sitting on the wheelchair left by my mother, I gritted my teeth and roared. That's my mother's wheelchair. What right do you have to sit on it? Get out. Julian was startled, but Isabella held him down and turned back to sneer. Still pretending? Even if I cut the scarf to pieces and let Julian sit on her wheelchair, she won't be angry with me. Do you believe it? My mother is already dead. Of course she can't be angry with you anymore, Isabella. When she heard me say this, she was stunned for a moment. Then she glanced and saw the cross-stitch that my mother hadn't finished before she died. The dark red bloodstains on it were the blood my mother spat out before she fainted. No! Amid my desperate cries, Isabella cut it to pieces. She always made these things that I don't like. Isn't she just trying to tie me down? In that case, let's cancel our wedding. I won't pay for your mother's medical expenses anymore, and I'll also ask the landlord to take back this house. You'd better take care of yourselves. As soon as she finished speaking, a furious shout came from the door. You unfilial daughter. Do you still know how to come back? The people who came were Isabella's parents. Her mother was clearly holding my mother's portrait in her arms. After my mother passed away, I couldn't get in touch with Isabella, so I could only call them. Isabella's parents rushed to my home overnight to comfort me and said that they would get my mother's portrait printed. At this moment, when the two of them saw Isabella, they were almost driven crazy with anger. Slap, her father slapped her hard in the face. I've been calling you for 2 days. Why did you turn off your phone? Do you know that Aunt Song was driven to death by anger 2 days ago? Isabella covered her face, her eyes wide open, full of disbelief. What? Auntie really passed away? What does it have to do with me? Dad, have you also been persuaded by them and are you acting together to deceive me? Isabella's father was so angry that he slapped her again. Do you think your mother and I are so idle that we would joke with you about such a thing? Tell me, what were you doing on the day of trying on the wedding dress and why did you keep your phone off? Julian sat on the wheelchair and came forward to explain, Uncle and Auntie, I had a car accident a few days ago. Isabella did it for me. Is this a place for you to speak? You're just a low-level employee. How dare you delay your superior's important business? Isabella's father turned around to scold him, but then he seemed to remember something. You're this pretty boy. I thought you were up to no good a year ago. What on earth are your skills that made my daughter keep you in the company? Our company never hires people with an education level below a bachelor's degree. I sneered and said, what else could it be? After her mother helped me up, I showed them the screenshots I had taken of Isabella's Weibo alternate account. After clearly seeing the two of them having an affair in the VIP ward of the hospital, Isabella's father was so angry that he kicked Isabella in the leg. She was forced to kneel down. I've raised you so big, and this is how you shame me? If I had known you would turn out like this, Lucas's father shouldn't have saved you in the first place. As he spoke, he took out his phone and fired Julian on the spot, and also demoted Isabella. Lucas, don't be sad. Uncle will compensate you. I shook my head and pointed at the wheelchair under Julian, saying, this is a keepsake of my mother. He has no right to sit on it. Isabella's father gave a furious shout, and Julian was so scared that he rolled off the wheelchair. Crawling on all fours to Isabella's side, he said, Sister Isabella, Didn't you say that my analysis made sense? Why didn't you tell the chairman about the possible speculation? Isabella's father frowned and asked, what speculation? Isabella raised her hand and slapped him hard in the face, then knelt upright and said, there's nothing. He's talking nonsense. Dad, I know I was wrong. Please forgive me, okay? Since they wouldn't say it, I would. I turned on my phone. I had recorded all the words they said at the end of the corridor that day. I did it in the hope of having a chance to clear my parents' names. They couldn't die and still be maliciously speculated about and wronged like this. As the recording played, Isabella's parents' faces turned darker and darker. I held the phone, my voice choked with sobs, and said, Uncle and Auntie, you all know the cause of my father's death back then, and you also caught that kidnapping gang. As for taking care of my mother, it was Isabella's own promise she made 5 years ago. All these years, we didn't force her to do these things. Even the proposal was her own will. At that time, she said she loved me and wanted to spend her whole life with me, so I agreed to her. I didn't expect that in just 1 year, she would change her mind. Isabella, if you didn't want to, you could have told me earlier. My mother and I are not the kind of people who would force others. But why did you say one thing and do another, which led to her death? I bent over in pain, covering my chest and shedding big tears. Isabella's father exuded a cold aura and said to Isabella word by word, the case back then has long been cleared up. Instead of being grateful, you're trying to shift the blame to find an excuse. I don't have a daughter like you. After saying that, he took out his phone and directly issued a new order to dismiss Isabella from her position. Isabella finally panicked and crawled on her knees in front of me, her eyes red from crying. I was wrong, Lucas. I shouldn't have so easily believed other people's nonsense. Please forgive me, okay? I pointed at my mother's portrait and shook my head. If my mother said she forgives you, then I'll forgive you. Isabella was stunned for a moment and then kowtowed heavily in front of my mother's portrait. Even when her head was bleeding, she was still shouting, I'm sorry, Auntie. I couldn't help but think of the past 5 years. My mother had always been kind and gentle to her. Whatever Isabella liked to eat, my mother would try hard to learn how to make it for her. When we quarreled, my mother always took her side. She was still speaking well of her until she died. She could clearly feel my mother's love, yet she still resented and slandered her behind her back. After all, we had loved the wrong person. No need, Isabella. My mother's condition worsened and she passed away after hearing you scold her for moral blackmail. A year ago, on the day you proposed to me, she was diagnosed with advanced pancreatic cancer. She didn't want you to worry, so she asked me to hide it from you. She said she would die without regrets if she could see us get married. But now she died with regret. You're the one who killed her. My words were full of pain, and Isabella shuddered all over. The blood on her forehead flowed all over her face. It seemed that she finally realized she was wrong, and she started desperately picking up the pieces of the cross-stitch and the scarf that she had just cut to pieces. No wonder, she said she wanted to give me my last wedding gift. But no matter how hard she tried to piece together the things that had been cut to pieces, they couldn't be restored to their original appearance. Forget it, Isabella. Before my mother died, she told me not to blame you. If you wanted freedom, I would give you your freedom. That's it. Let's end it here. I picked up my mother's portrait and turned to leave. A pair of hands grabbed the hem of my clothes. Lucas, trust me. I was just confused for a moment. The proposal to you was sincere, and the promise to take care of your mother for a lifetime was also sincere. Isabella's voice was filled with sobs. But I didn't want to believe anymore. When I saw with my own eyes that she was having fun with Julian in the ward, my heart died. Isabella, I can't afford your love. Give it to him. I pointed at Julian on the ground and left without looking back. Until the next day when my mother was buried, Isabella came wearing all white with swollen eyes. After the pastor finished reading the eulogy, she was a bit dazed because she wasn't mentioned at all during the whole process. Even her parents were mentioned and thanked, but strangely enough, there was no mention of her, the future daughter-in-law. Seeing her trembling all over, with a confused and painful look in her eyes, I felt a bit satisfied in my heart. Miss Isabella, my mother's last words mentioned you. Isabella's face changed, and she looked up at me with some surprise. Isabella, this is the last time I'll call you like this. I respect my mother's last wish and give you the freedom you want. Our marriage contract is officially void. From now on, we have nothing to do with each other. After saying this, I took out the watch she gave me when she proposed from my pocket and threw it back to her. Then I turned around and left in big strides, ignoring her regretful wailing. Our wedding turned into a funeral. The red color that should have been full of joy turned into the white color of sorrow, filling the whole place. Relatives and friends all expressed their condolences and regrets. After all, half a month ago, they were told that they were going to attend a wedding, but it turned out like this. I locked myself in the room for a whole week, and Isabella came to me every day to confess. She said that she had just made a mistake that everyone in the world could make, and she was just confused for a moment. During the 5 years your mother was ill, I accompanied you to take care of her except when I was in class. It wasn't until I started working that I realized how wonderful the outside world was. I'm sorry. I didn't resist the temptation of something new and believed Julian's nonsense. I finally had some spirit and wanted to know what kind of nonsense could make her betray her own vow. He said that loving someone is like raising a flower, and I, this delicate and beautiful flower, didn't seem very happy. At that time, I didn't take it to heart. But until he started caring about me every day and sending me some small surprises from time to time, I was a bit touched. So that's how it was. Since my father died and my mother got sick, I didn't have much energy to do these things anymore. All I could give Isabella was an honest heart and all my love. But under Julian's temptation, she was no longer satisfied with these. I should have noticed it earlier. You could have just told me that you didn't want to get married anymore and that you regretted it. My mother and I would have understood. Isabella was stunned for a moment, and tears streamed down her face. She gave a self-deprecating smile. I've never regretted it. It's just that I'm also tired. No one lives an easy life, Isabella. My mother and I are 100 times more tired than you. And all of this is just because my father saved you out of righteousness back then. Hearing me say this, Isabella's face darkened. I'm sorry. I know you're just saying angry words. You and Auntie don't think like that. That's why you've loved me so much all these years. Maybe. But now, this is how I think. I interrupted her, my eyes cold and resolute. You don't need to apologize. My mother surely wouldn't be willing to blame you. I don't blame you either now, because we have no relationship anymore. Regret that came too late appeared on Isabella's face. All these years, my mother had been better to her than to me. My mother always said that Isabella was the child my father saved with his life, and she should take good care of her. Even on the day Isabella proposed to me, when some people around were teasing and saying that they hoped we would have children soon, my mother smiled and vetoed it. She took Isabella's hand and said, "You can go and have fun and enjoy yourselves after you get married. Don't stay with this disabled old woman of mine anymore." At that time, Isabella was a bit puzzled why my mother would suddenly say such things. Now, she finally understood that my mother had long known that she didn't have much time left. But even so, my mother still didn't urge us to have children or get married. Instead, she had been comforting Isabella all the time. If she really wanted Isabella to repay her kindness and wanted to morally blackmail her, how could she have said those words? Over the past 5 years, I had been self-reliant and didn't completely rely on Isabella's family. Because my father had taught me since I was a child to be upright and not always think about taking advantage of others. We were already very grateful that Isabella had accompanied us all these years. So, apart from the medical expenses she insisted on paying and the rent for this house which was very close to the hospital, I had never asked her for any other expenses. Isabella in front of me finally seemed to have realized this. With the wound still on her forehead, she broke down and cried again, kowtowing frequently towards my mother's room. "I'm sorry, Mom. I know you like it when I call you like this. Mom, I was wrong." Last year, she forgot my mother's birthday and was accompanying her male secretary. I quarreled with her and was angry because of that, but she easily came back with a bunch of tulips 3 days later. The first thing she did when she saw my mother was to give her a big hug, and then she said sweetly, "Mom, happy birthday to you. May every day be as wonderful as today, and may you have a great year every year." The moment my mother heard her call her like that, she was so happy that her eyes turned red. She hugged her and kept saying thank you, my dear girl. My mother never cared about these little things with Isabella because she regarded her as her own daughter. Thinking of my mother's kind smile when she was alive, my heart ached with pain, and my eyes stung. I wanted to scold Isabella, but I couldn't make any sound. Before losing consciousness, I saw Isabella shouting something in a panic. I listened carefully, and it seemed that she was saying, asking me not to fall asleep, that she couldn't lose me again. However, my mother and I had already lost her a long time ago. When I opened my eyes again, it was night. I was lying in the hospital, and the smell of disinfectant filled my nostrils. I raised my hand and tried to get up, but I found that there was a needle inserted into the back of my hand, and it was nutrient solution. Lucas, you're finally awake. You've been in a coma for 3 days. You scared me to death. Isabella couldn't contain her excitement when she saw me wake up and held my hand tightly. At this moment, she completely lost her previous look of a cold and glamorous female CEO. She had deep eye bags, and the tears on her face had smudged her previous makeup, making her look very ugly. Isabella's father and mother also stood up from behind and asked me how I felt and if I wanted to eat something. I shook my head and struggled to get up. Isabella eagerly took a pillow and placed it behind me. Uncle and Auntie, thank you for your help to me and my mother over the past few years. My mother is gone, and Isabella won't be morally blackmailed and tied to us anymore. I know it's not fair to her. She deserves someone better. I looked at Isabella calmly, but she shook her head while crying. No, I only want you. I only like you, Lucas. I was wrong about the past. Can you give me another chance to take care of you? At this moment, I no longer felt any hatred towards her, only exhaustion. I'm not qualified to say that I forgive you. Because you drove my mother to death with your anger. The doctor originally said that she could live for a few more months. It's a pity that she still couldn't wait until the day her wish came true. Don't worry. As I said, she definitely wouldn't be willing to blame you. She would only think that she was dragging you down and making you suffer. I slowly said these words, but Isabella cried even louder. How could she not know? After getting along with my mother day and night for all these years, she already knew what kind of person my mother was. My mother was actually a warm and kind person. When my father passed away, although she was greatly shocked, she still became strong and regained her optimism. Because she said that the living should inherit the will of the dead. However, such a warm and kind mother didn't end well in the end. Under Isabella's growing disgust and impatience, all her strength and confidence were destroyed. In the past 2 years, Isabella had become more and more impatient with her. She didn't even show up during festivals and only made a cold phone call to send a blessing. Since Julian appeared a year ago, she had been frequently out of touch and rarely accompanied my mother. She also didn't have much patience. She said that my mother had been paralyzed for these years and had been out of touch with the outside world, and she didn't understand what young people wanted now at all. Late at night, my mother told me these things a little sadly, smiling desolately, and asked me, Lucas, I searched and it said that young people nowadays want freedom the most. Do you think I'm making her feel unfree? Thinking of this, my heart ached as if it was being pierced by 1,000 arrows. Isabella, do you know? Not long after my mother asked this, she was diagnosed with advanced cancer, and her reaction made me feel very distressed. Isabella stopped crying and looked at me with a mixture of expectation and fear. She said, It's great. I won't be dragging you down anymore. Isabella and you can both be free. My mother was thinking of us until she died. Do you think such a mother would have the heart to morally blackmail you? I was sobbing uncontrollably and asked Isabella through gritted teeth. The light in her eyes finally went out completely, and she knelt on the ground crying bitterly. She said that she had never thought like that. It was just that when Julian asked her about it, she felt a bit embarrassed, as if her life had been kidnapped, so she developed a sense of disgust and rebellion and just talked nonsense behind people's backs to vent. In fact, she was very clear about how kind my mother was to her, and I had given her my whole heart. As she spoke, she took out the necklace I gave her from around her neck. Lucas, this is the gift you bought for me with your bonus after working overtime for a month. Do you remember? Of course I remembered. As the daughter of the chairman and a CEO herself, she didn't lack anything at all. But I just wanted to give her the best within my ability, so I was willing to endure any hardship. At that time, I collapsed from working overtime continuously. When I took out this gift from my arms, she scolded me for being stupid with red eyes. Lucas, I know that you only love me in your heart. Because your parents are both such good people. If I marry you, I will definitely be very happy. I have no doubt that you will love me with your life, so don't feel pressured to be with me. Among the things in this world, what's truly precious is not material things but feelings. At that time, I was deeply moved by her words. But now, I don't want to believe anymore. It's all in the past. Let's forget it. I snatched the necklace and threw it out of the window. Isabella, in the past 5 years, no, 10 years, I have always loved you. But I'm sorry, that's it. I don't love you anymore. You can leave. I said this calmly, but Isabella looked at me in disbelief. What did you say? I let out a low laugh and slowly told the story of the past. She didn't know that I actually liked her a long time ago. A few years earlier than she thought. At that time, I was only 15 years old. On my way home from school, I was blocked in an alley by a group of school bullies who extorted money from me. They found the birthday gift I bought for my father. It was an electronic watch that I had saved up my pocket money for several months to buy. When they snatched it away, I fought back desperately, but I was pinned to the ground and kicked and beaten. Hello? Is that the police officer? There are people here robbing and hitting others. Please come quickly. A clear and pleasant female voice sounded, and it was Isabella. The little gangsters dropped the watch and ran away, and they didn't forget to step on it hard twice before running away. Isabella helped me up, and I cried while holding the crushed watch. She rummaged through her bag, took out a stack of money, and stuffed it into my hand. Go and buy a new one. It seemed that she saw my hesitation. She smiled, and her smile illuminated my heart like the sun. Just consider it as if you owe me. I took the money and nodded. I will definitely pay you back. That day, I knew her name. Unfortunately, I never met her again. Until my father saved her out of righteousness. When I rushed there, my father was on the verge of death. Son, I just found out her name. She is the girl you've been looking for. Dad protected her for you. From now on, it's up to you. I almost choked with sobs and then realized that my father had risked his life to protect her, and it was all because of my feelings when I was young. If he had waited for rescue at that time, Isabella might have just been injured at most and wouldn't have died immediately. After all, the kidnapper's purpose was to extort money. But when my father heard her name, he didn't care anymore. My father, who had always taught me not to be a hero recklessly, was killed for being a hero for me. At that time, I knew that the murderer who killed my father was myself. It was my ignorant infatuation when I was young that killed him. I had harmed my own parents. From then on, I thought that I no longer had the right to say that I loved someone. So, I tried my best to be good to my mother and Isabella. Even when she lost her temper and was willful, I tolerated her. But now, I have already repaid her kindness to me. My father had already repaid it for me. After hearing all these, Isabella was completely stunned. It was a long time before she rushed over and hugged me, crying loudly. Lucas, I was wrong. I betrayed your love, and I wrongly blamed your family. I deserve to die. Yes, she actually suspected that my father was related to the kidnapping case all those years after my father's death. But she didn't know that my father had risked his life to save her just because of my love when I was young. Now that the truth was out, Isabella was heartbroken, but I just felt very tired. Uncle and Auntie, please take her away. I want to rest. Isabella was forcibly dragged away, and her crying voice grew fainter and fainter. I stayed in the hospital for a month, which was the result of Isabella's father's insistence. He said that I must not leave until my body was properly recuperated, even if he had to beg me. Thinking of my parents' last wishes before they died, I agreed. Nothing is more important than my living healthily. I have to carry on my parents' unfulfilled aspirations. During this month, Isabella came to see me every day, but I refused to meet her. She would just look at me from a distance, shed tears silently, and then leave some things behind before departing. There was the soup she cooked with her own hands and the letters she wrote. I asked the nurse to throw all of them into the trash can. I didn't want to have anything to do with them. After this incident, there was no possibility between her and me anymore. Isabella's father also came to persuade me, but I was very insistent, and he could only sigh and leave. Later, I recovered and was discharged from the hospital. Isabella stood downstairs of the hospital, holding a bunch of daisies in her arms and looking at me from a distance. When we passed by each other, she said, "I wish you peace and health." Thank you. I didn't take the bunch of flowers. I just replied softly and didn't stop, continuing to move forward. After I went back, I moved out of that house and changed to a different city to work and live. The Zhongyuan festival came quickly. When I went to burn paper for my parents, I found that Isabella was also there. She was bending over to pull out the weeds around the grave. Her 2 hands were scratched and bleeding, but she seemed not to notice at all. There were calla lilies, which were my mother's favorite when she was alive, placed on the grave. They had already been peeled. There was also a hand-knitted scarf and a cross-stitch. On the cross-stitch was embroidered a middle-aged couple snuggling up and watching the sunset. Next to them, there was also a men's watch. Was this Isabella's way of atoning for her sins? I didn't feel much. I knelt down by myself and started burning the paper. When Isabella saw me, she was very surprised and wanted to come over, but she held back. Just like that, she stood silently by the side, watching me finish burning the paper, kowtow, and then leave. Thank you. I still only said these 2 words. The setting sun was going down, just illuminating the grave of my parents. Vaguely, I seemed to really see them snuggling up and watching the sunset. Isabella's choked sobs drifted over with the wind. Lucas, Julian was arrested some time ago. For fraud. I just realized that he had deceived me. He approached me by taking advantage of my sympathy. In fact, he was just a liar who specialized in cheating women out of their money. He has already received his retribution. Do you feel any better? I stopped in my tracks but didn't look back. No matter what, my parents can never come back to life, can they? The implication was that I could never forgive them. I know, so I've been atoning for my sins. There's no need. It's too late. I'm going down the mountain now. I left a sentence and strode away. Isabella looked at my departing back and gave a bitter smile. Yes, it's too late. No matter how much she did, it was too late. The fragrance of osmanthus wafted from the mountains, and the breath of autumn grew stronger. I strode towards my new life and never looked back again.